100 million people faces zero-day evacuation as Iran threatens Gulf water plants. Picture this. You wake up in Dubai at 6 in the morning, you turn on the faucet, nothing comes out. You try the second tap, nothing. A government emergency alert floods your phone. Water rationing begins immediately. Conserve all available reserves. You look out the window at the gleaming skyline, the towers, the malls, the artificial ski slope sitting in the middle of the desert. And you realize that everything you see, every structure, every life in that city was built on the assumption that a thin ribbon of coastal infrastructure would keep working. And right now, that assumption is broken. This is not a hypothetical scenario conjured for dramatic effect. This is the precise operational outcome that military analysts, water security specialists, and humanitarian organizations are now modeling in real time. Because the threat driving it is no longer theoretical. It has a name, a motive, a geography, and a timeline. The Arabian Peninsula, home to over 190 million people across the Gulf Cooperation Council states, is caught inside one of the most strategically dangerous situations in recent modern history, and the weapon at the center of it is not a missile, not an aircraft carrier, not a nuclear warhead, it is water. To understand why the region faces a crossroads it has never encountered before, start with a fact so fundamental it is often overlooked in geopolitical analysis. The Gulf does not have water. The Arabian Peninsula receives an average of less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, dropping below 50 millimeters in the driest interior zones. There are no permanent rivers. The great fossil aquifers beneath the desert floor are being drawn down far faster than any natural cycle could replenish them. The hydrological baseline of this region has always been terminal scarcity. What changed everything was a single technology deployed at enormous scale beginning in the latter 20th century: desalination. Desalination transformed the Gulf from a region capable of sustaining a few million people in scattered coastal settlements into a modern civilizational powerhouse. Today, more than 400 desalination facilities line the coastlines of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. According to World Bank data, approximately 44% of the entire global desalination capacity is concentrated in this single region. Nearly half of all industrial freshwater production capacity on Earth sits within a stretch of coastline that, in military terms, can be surveyed and reached from a single adversary's territory. The national dependency figures are even more specific. Kuwait obtains approximately 90% of its drinking water from desalination. For the UAE, the figure mirrors that level. Oman depends on desalination for roughly 86% of its freshwater supply. Across Saudi Arabia, the national average sits at approximately 70%, but that number conceals a critical internal geography. Cities like Riyadh, located hundreds of kilometers from any coast, are entirely fed through massive long-distance pipeline systems originating at coastal desalination complexes. There is no secondary river to tap. There is no backup aquifer capable of sustaining a major urban population. If the pipelines stop, Riyadh stops. This is the infrastructure reality that makes the current situation so volatile, because every one of those 400-plus facilities, every pipeline, every coastal pumping complex is not buried underground behind military-grade protection. It is civilian infrastructure, built on open coastlines for efficient access to seawater, not for survivability in a conflict environment, visible from the sea, visible from the air, and accessible to the full range of modern standoff weapons. Military planners have understood this vulnerability for years. What has changed is that this understanding has moved from classified strategic assessments into the active calculus of a live regional confrontation. The incident that crystallized this shift came in early March. A port facility located approximately 20 kilometers from the UAE's Jebel Ali desalination complex, a plant producing an estimated 160 billion gallons of treated water annually, sustained damage during a broader exchange of strikes in the region. The proximity was not lost on anyone who understood what Jebel Ali represents. It is not merely a water plant. It is the life support system for one of the most densely populated urban corridors in the Middle East. Kuwait's Doha West Complex and the UAE's Fujairah F1 facility were simultaneously drawn into scrutiny over indirect structural pressure, raising immediate questions about their operational continuity under sustained engagement conditions. The question that defense analysts began asking out loud, and that government officials in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait City, and Doha were asking privately, had already advanced past, could these facilities be targeted? The operative question had become, what happens when they are, and how fast does everything else follow? The answer, when modeled through emergency management frameworks, is both specific and alarming. Most Gulf states currently maintain emergency freshwater reserves ranging from approximately 2 to 7 days of supply at normal consumption rates. 7 days is not a margin. It is a countdown. in a scenario where multiple major desalination facilities are incapacitated simultaneously through kinetic strikes, precision drone attacks on operational systems, or cyber intrusions into the industrial control infrastructure managing pumping, chemical treatment, and distribution. Those reserves drain immediately. By day 3 or 4, rationing becomes unavoidable in major cities. By day 5 or 6, hospitals begin facing critical shortfalls. The healthcare cascade often moves faster than the water shortage itself. Hospitals are among the highest per capita consumers of purified water in any urban system. Operating rooms cannot function. Intensive care units cannot maintain sterile environments. Dialysis patients, hundreds of thousands across the Gulf region, face life-threatening interruptions within hours, not days. Pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities that depend on ultra-purified water shut down, cutting off medications that chronically ill patients require continuously. These are not abstract downstream consequences. They are near immediate, measurable human costs that no emergency response infrastructure in the region is currently sized to handle at metropolitan scale. Beyond healthcare, the cascading effects move into sanitation. Water pressure is not merely a comfort. It is the mechanical force that keeps sewage systems operational. When pressure drops across an urban network, wastewater systems back up. In a city the size of Dubai, Riyadh, or Doha, sewage system failure within days of water supply interruption would be severe and nearly impossible to contain through emergency response. Waterborne disease in an overcrowded, water-stressed urban environment is not a risk to be modeled. It is an outcome to be expected. Food security follows the same downward trajectory. Gulf states import the overwhelming majority of their food. Basic commodity import dependency exceeds 85% in several countries. That food arrives through ports. Ports require water to function. When logistics networks collapse under a water crisis, import flows stop. Shelves empty within days. The economic shock of simultaneous price spikes and supply failures would generate social pressures that no government in the region has contingency plans to absorb at that scale. For approximately 30 million migrant workers living across Gulf states, drawn primarily from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, the situation would be worse still. Emergency water distribution is structured around citizen welfare frameworks. Migrant workers occupy the lowest priority tier. When water is cut, they are affected first, hardest, and with the fewest options for exit. Water economist Esther Krauer-Delbour, speaking to AFP on regional water security, framed the systemic risk precisely. Threatening water resources carries the potential to trigger a confrontation far larger and more destructive than whatever military exchange preceded it. UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Volker Turk issued a formal warning in mid-March, noting that existing strikes on fuel and energy infrastructure had already generated toxic smoke clouds and acid rain concerns across populated areas. Adding water infrastructure to that damage profile would multiply the environmental harm exponentially. Desalination plants carry significant inventories of chlorine and concentrated brine waste. A physically ruptured facility does not simply stop producing water. It releases its operational chemistry into the surrounding marine environment, which is the same body of water from which every other regional facility draws its raw input. The contamination loop is not theoretical. It is mechanically inherent to the system. The CSIS has explicitly analyzed the additional vulnerability of these facilities to cyber operations targeting industrial control infrastructure, the SCADA networks governing pressure valves, chemical injection, filtration, and distribution routing. A sophisticated cyber operation would not necessarily produce a visible explosion. It might cause a chemical dosing error or filtration failure that renders output water unusable or actively harmful before anyone identifies the source. This vector requires no missiles. It requires only technical capability and access. And the assessment is that such capability exists in the regional threat environment. Now, here is where the situation becomes more complex than a straightforward narrative of one power threatening another. Iran, the state around whose actions this threat matrix revolves, is itself in the grip of one of the most severe water crises anywhere on Earth. This is not a footnote, it is the central paradox of the standoff. Iran's dam reservoir system is operating at approximately 10% of capacity across multiple key basins. Rivers that historically defined the agricultural landscape of provinces like Khuzestan have been reduced to seasonal trickles or disappeared entirely. Groundwater extraction has so far exceeded natural recharge rates that land surface in parts of Tehran is subsiding by as much as 35 centimeters per year. Approximately 27,000 villages across Iran were already experiencing chronic water shortfalls before the present unpleasant period of regional tension, and water protests in Khuzestan have erupted repeatedly in recent years. There were credible reports through 2024 and into 2025 that authorities were studying the feasibility of relocating portions of Greater Tehran, a metropolitan population of approximately 10 million, to coastal zones, a tacit acknowledgement that inland water supply for a major national capital can no longer be guaranteed. And yet, Iran's desalination dependency is negligible by comparison, approximately 2% of its total water supply. This asymmetry is the structural foundation of Iran's tactical position. Kamran Madani, a water management specialist with extensive regional expertise, has articulated the logic directly. Iran is the party least dependent on desalination infrastructure, which is precisely why targeting it appears to form part of a calculated pressure strategy. You attack your adversary's greatest structural vulnerability from a position of comparative advantage, even if your own condition is deteriorating. A government managing a domestic water collapse and acute legitimacy challenges driven by resource scarcity has a different escalation threshold than one operating from stability. The water coercion strategy is not the choice of a state acting from strength. It is the choice of a state that believes it has exhausted less costly options. That makes it more dangerous, not less. The shadow of the Bushehr nuclear power plant on Iran's coast along the Persian Gulf hangs over this entire calculation. A Reuters analysis cited by Foreign Policy Research drew a distinction demanding precise understanding. A strike on enrichment or conversion facilities would produce a localized chemical hazard, serious but geographically containable. A strike on the Bushehr reactor itself, an operating civilian nuclear plant with fuel on site, would produce a contamination scenario of an entirely different order. Radioactive material dispersed into the Persian Gulf cannot be contained by any mechanism currently available. Desalination plants cannot process radioactive contamination out of seawater. A Bushehr catastrophe would render the Persian Gulf surface water unusable as desalination input, long-term and potentially permanent for affected areas. The Gulf states would lose not just a facility, but the raw material for all facilities simultaneously. That is not military escalation. That is a civilizational event. Saudi Arabia's response has moved beyond diplomatic language. Bloomberg reporting indicates that Riyadh has communicated directly to Washington a red line with the weight of formal military commitment. If Iranian forces strike Saudi energy or water infrastructure, Saudi Arabia will respond immediately against Iranian strategic targets at full capacity. This is a declaratory policy shift of historic significance. For years, the Gulf-Iran confrontation was mediated through proxy actors. Houthi forces in Yemen, Iranian-aligned militia networks in Iraq, Hezbollah's regional reach. Riyadh tolerated that architecture because it preserved deniability and bounded direct costs. The moment an Iranian weapon strikes a Saudi desalination facility, that architecture is finished. The response will be direct, immediate, and targeted at Iran's most sensitive infrastructure, which by Iran's own energy minister's admission already includes dozens of water-related facilities hit in previous exchanges. The UAE and Kuwait have moved toward parallel declarations, aligning with Riyadh in a collective posture that analysts describe as a structural shift in regional deterrence. The broader defensive coalition has deployed Patriot air defense batteries around major desalination complexes. A move that reveals with stark clarity how the hierarchy of strategic protection has shifted. The world's most sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems are now positioned to defend water pumps. Not command centers, not naval bases, water pumps. That sentence captures something fundamental about where the real fragilities of modern civilization are located. CSCS analyst David Michel has assessed that partial damage to a major desalination facility could require weeks of repair, with full reconstruction following a serious strike potentially taking upward of 2 years. 2 years cannot be bridged by emergency tankers at the scale of urban populations in the millions. Gulf states have accordingly diversified their contingency architecture, Saudi Arabia advancing Red Sea pipeline redundancies, the UAE constructing facilities across multiple dispersed coastal zones. The Atlantic Council has identified anti-drone capability as the most urgent near-term need, given that the most probable initial threat vector is a saturation attack by low-cost unmanned systems capable of overwhelming conventional point defense networks through volume alone. The global economic dimension of a sustained Gulf water crisis is not separate from the humanitarian one, it is its logical extension. Oil refineries and LNG processing facilities are enormous consumers of industrial freshwater. When Gulf water production is disrupted, energy production stops almost immediately. Saudi Aramco's processing network, Abu Dhabi's ADNOC infrastructure, Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, which alone accounts for approximately 20% of global LNG exports, cannot sustain operations without water. Qatar's LNG supplies between 12 and 14% of Europe's natural gas requirements. The Strait of Hormuz is already under pressure from regional developments that have elevated European energy prices by an estimated 35%. A simultaneous water-induced collapse of Gulf energy production into that environment would generate a price shock without modern precedent. Fertilizer production depends on natural gas. Agricultural yields depend on fertilizer. Food prices in import-dependent regions from South Asia to North Africa are already structurally fragile. The chain does not stop at energy. Georgetown University's Marwa Daoud has situated the Gulf water threat within a documented wider pattern. The deliberate targeting of civilian water infrastructure as a strategic instrument has appeared in multiple recent conflicts in other theaters. Each time this approach is employed and accepted in one context, the threshold for its use in the next drops. The Gulf is now embedded within that trend. The normalization of civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, food supply chains, as a legitimate strategic target represents one of the most consequential shifts in the conduct of modern conflict. Once those norms erode, they do not easily reconstitute. What has fundamentally shifted in the regional security calculus is the collapse of indirect engagement as the default framework. For decades, Gulf states and Iran operated within managed tension that preserved channels for containment, proxy actors, diplomatic back channels, international mediation. Those structures existed to prevent a direct state-level clash from becoming the primary dynamic. That structure is now under severe and visible stress. The red lines being declared by Gulf governments are not postures designed to create negotiating leverage. They are statements of military intent by states with the capability, motivation, and perceived necessity to follow through. When a government deploys its highest-tier air defense systems around civilian water infrastructure and commits publicly to direct retaliation, the diplomatic architecture of the previous era is not under pressure. It is in the past. Iran's position in this dynamic is strategically paradoxical in a way that makes it structurally volatile. A regime managing a domestic water collapse, a damaged energy grid, an economy under sustained external pressure, and a military posture overstretched relative to its operational reserves is not acting from confidence. It is acting from constraint. Constrained actors, when they assess that the cost of restraint has exceeded the cost of action, make decisions that more stable actors would not make. Standard deterrence assumes adversaries calculating cost with some baseline of stability. When the adversary faces acute domestic legitimacy challenges driven by resource shortages, those assumptions become unreliable precisely when reliability matters most. The specific signals that will define the next phase are observable. Any strike affecting a water production facility, even one framed as collateral, will test Gulf Red Line declarations immediately, revealing whether stated commitments translate into operational responses. The positioning of U.S. naval and air assets in the region will signal whether Washington is prepared to back Gulf infrastructure defense with military posture or confine its role to diplomatic expression. The pace of emergency reserve construction and pipeline redundancy investment will indicate how seriously each government assesses near-term risk. And Iran's domestic trajectory, the depth of its water crisis, the stability of provincial governance under resource stress, the behavior of its leadership under dual pressure from external exposure and internal discontent, will be the variable that ultimately determines whether this situation finds a ceiling or continues into territory for which no current analytical framework provides a map. What is certain is this: the rules of engagement in this region have been rewritten. The battlefield is no longer defined exclusively by where soldiers and weapons meet. It is defined by where civilizations are most fragile. For 190 million people in the world's driest inhabited region, that fragile point is a glass of water. The skyscrapers will still be standing when the taps run dry. What the next phase of this situation will reveal is whether the systems protecting those taps can hold, or whether the most essential resource of modern life becomes the casualty that changes everything that follows. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.